When I woke up on that Friday morning, it was very early and I was on a canal boat with a friend, and we'd had a dreadful journey getting there. Trains were cancelled and we'd hardly had any sleep. And we'd both been campaigning for leave, but when on the day before I was at a station in Lewisham, where I live, a man had bounded up to me saying, "Oh, well, you've lost, haven't you? The voting figures say that Remain has won." So I was a bit surprised that he said that, because voting was still going on for another 5 hours or so. And when I woke up the next morning, it wasn't clear what the result was. I heard the radio, there were results still coming through. It was about 5:30. And then it appeared that it was likely to be that we'd decided to leave the EU. And of course, I was very pleased. It was a real surprise to me, and I was very glad about that. Well, I was active as a campaigner for leave. I'm in a local political party which took a decision to campaign for leave, Lewisham People Before Profit. And so I produced posters and we produced leaflets as well. And I gave those out at places like bus stops and where people were gathered, and at railway stations. And at one point, when I was giving out the cards at Brockley railway station, somebody very rudely just said, "You're a racist." And I just felt that was a position of ignorance that someone had taken. I'm not a racist as far as I know. And to associate wanting to leave with racism automatically seemed to me to be a very ignorant position. And someone had just kind of fallen for propaganda, I suppose. And then the other day, I was down in Deptford, where there was a stall for the Brexit Party candidate. And I was talking to some of the people there, and somebody came along, and he was obviously drunk, I think, but he headbutted me on my nose, and it's quite a violent action. And he was shouting, "You're all racists," and this kind of thing. So it's not always very pleasant to be associated with Brexit, and I certainly don't hide my views. And I don't know if that kind of fear has prevented other people from saying that they are for Brexit, particularly here in London, where the majority of people voted for Remain. But I do meet people who tell me that they voted for leave and who are reluctant for that to be known widely. Well, if we finally leave, and that's in doubt now because of the Labour Party's attitude and the way that members of Parliament in the Labour Party have pushed their policy to be very much more for Remain, despite having agreed to respect the referendum result. If we leave, then in the long term, I hope that bringing back sovereignty to the UK Parliament will mean that a government can be elected in the future that can actually carry out many of the policies that Labour is currently promoting in this election. Those are such as renationalisation of utilities, of the railways, which is strictly forbidden under the EU Fourth Rail Directive, of bringing in more radical policies to save the earth from the dangers of climate change, more radical than is likely to be brought in by the EU, which requires the agreement of 27 or 28 countries at the same time. The EU is, for me, a brake on BRAKE, on radical policies being pursued in any country, because their neoliberal agenda tends to prioritise the needs and demands of large multinational companies. And while capitalism still rules in Britain quite securely, there is more of a chance of being able to make a more equitable balance between the needs of the people and the needs of the big companies in one country than in the whole of the EU, I feel. I may be wrong, but I'm willing to give that a try. And as for issues to do with trade and tariffs, which are often brought up, I see leaving the EU as a great opportunity for there to be increased tariffs on trade. Much of this trade is unnecessary. We should be making things here in Britain which we need here in Britain. We should be reopening manufacturing, reskilling the workforce after the 40 years or so since Thatcher came in, when our country has been de-skilled. Trade, bringing things across the world, all this globalization, is one of the problems that has caused climate change. And it just means that we are nowadays a country that makes very little of the things that we need. We rely on cheap imports from other countries. And then there's the issue of cheap labour being imported from other parts of the EU. So while I have nothing against people from other countries coming to Britain and people from here going to work in other countries, it shouldn't be done just to reduce the labour rates, the wages that are paid. And we all know that in certain spheres, agricultural work, for example, cheap labour is brought in from other countries in the EU because that's easy under the current rules. And that pushes down the rates of labour, and people in Britain, there's other reasons for this as well, but they're unwilling to work in those kind of industries. So I look forward to a time when we can make our own decisions about how we want Britain to be in a more socialist way, and that we can become more self-reliant. Well, the result has meant that I've realised that more people are in favour of leaving than I expected. I thought the propaganda from both sides was pretty poor in the referendum campaign. Both sides were lying, and for me that didn't matter because I've been opposed to the EU since we joined in 1971, and I voted against it in the referendum in 74. But what it showed me is, I suppose, that for those that are now out-and-out Remainers, people who don't want us to leave the EU, I've been surprised at their hostility to people who voted to leave. I don't just mean the couple of incidents I mentioned earlier, but often people use the term Brexiteer as really a term of abuse, a derogatory term. In this part of London where I live, some people just feel that we all think we should stay round here. You know, there may be a few odd people who voted to leave and they must be off their heads, or they love Nigel Farage or something, or they're racists, or they want foreigners out. That isn't the case for me and for other people I know who voted to leave. So it's brought out some realisation of the way people have been manipulated, I think, on both sides probably. But we do have to overcome that, because we have to live together and work together for a better society. And yet at the moment, with Parliament having thwarted Brexit so far, obviously hand in hand with the EU, which has always tried to get people to vote again when they didn't like the result, such as in France, in Ireland and in Denmark. You know, the way they deal with it is have another referendum, change the question a bit, throw some more money at it. So I don't know if they're going to be successful in doing that here now, but if they are, if we do have another referendum and if the result is the other way, to stay in the EU, then I think all of those, or many of those people who voted to leave in the first place, will just give up totally on passive voting politics, and some will turn to alternative avenues to make their voices heard. I mean, we see the Gilets jaunes in France who have been forgotten, who've been left behind, who are totally ignored, particularly those in the countryside. And the images are shown of Gilets jaunes being violent. In fact, most of the violence comes from the police. And from my understanding of it, and the number of injuries is horrific in France. But we can expect something similar in Britain if the result is overturned, I think. Well, it's now 3.5 years since the referendum. We're in November now, 2019, and certainly the country is divided on the issue of leave or remain. But I don't think that's just something that's been revealed by the Brexit referendum. We have to, well, in my view, Britain's divided between, because I'm a Marxist, the ruling class and the workers. And the workers in this case, in this sense, means, as Marx defined them, everybody who has to go and sell their labour power in order to survive. We don't really have a peasantry. We have a very small number of people who can survive by working their own land. And we have an aristocracy, relatively small. But most people, they may call themselves middle class, they may call themselves A, B, C, D, E, or C2, or these various things, but most people go to work for a living. And what we need, in my view, to emphasise is that all of those who have to go to work for their living have much more in common with each other than they do with the big bosses who are trying to make money out of them, who don't pay them the full value of the labour power they've given. And so although we are divided amongst the working people, between people who want to remain and leave, and that division often takes the line between poorer and more well-off workers, I think we do have to accept that there's been a certain amount of deprivation through people who were mainly working in industry in the past, or low-skilled jobs, who have got no perspective. They don't necessarily go on foreign holidays or have a lot of friends from other countries if they live in communities without a large number of immigrants. And they are, quite rightly, left behind. There's so little perspective nowadays for young people coming out of school or college in a town which might have been a one-industry town. It might have been car making, shipbuilding, coal mining, cotton weaving in the past. And now they're being encouraged to go into media studies degrees. And what does that really mean? Isn't education and higher education these days just a way of keeping the unemployment levels down and making money out of people by making them take great loans for their studies? I think there's a huge divide and we have to overcome it. And I hope that when we leave the EU, that doesn't, by the way, mean we can't go on foreign holidays. It doesn't mean you have to get a visa to go to France. It's to do with the ending the freedom of movement of labour, not the freedom of movement of people to travel on holiday. It doesn't mean cutting ourselves off from Europe, which is slightly besides the question you actually asked. But I hope we can try to reunify working people to have a common feeling of purpose, to make Britain a pleasant place for us all to live, taking care of the climate, which is looking after the whole world, of course. It's a world problem. But also about human decency. People feel more part of society if they think they're giving something useful to it. Somebody who's on the dole or on a training course or a 0 hours contract and doesn't know how they're going to make the week's money last can't feel proud to be part of a society. And we have to overcome that if we're going to have a decent future for everybody. The alternative would be for those people to embark in a violent revolution and there to be lots of bloodshed, probably mainly on the side of the workers being put down by the army or police in a repressive regime. And I hope we don't have to do that. Uncertain.